Hey there, it's Mattea. Thanks for taking the time to listen to Bookends today. If you've been enjoying our show, it would be a huge help for us, and I think also for you, to follow us on your favorite podcast app, whether that's Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Overcast, whatever app you use to listen. This will ultimately help us make more Bookends episodes and connect you with more of your favorite authors. I hope you enjoyed today's show. Thanks so much for listening. Hey, welcome to Bookends. I'm Mattea Roach. For as long as I can remember reading novels, I've always really enjoyed metafiction in my storytelling. Something about blurring the line between fantasy and reality, having to think about the architecture of how a story is told just tickles my brain in a way that I really enjoy. And my guest today, the Nigerian American author Nnedi Okorafor, thinks a lot about storytelling, reality, and the future in her sci-fi and fantasy novels. Her latest book is called Death of the Author, and it takes a metafictional approach to explore what it means to be a Nigerian American storyteller, and also what it means to be an author in a world of AI and robots. Nnedi Okorafor has won some of the biggest awards for science fiction writers, including the Nebula and the Hugo. I reached her in San Francisco. Hi, Nnedi. How are you?
I'm doing great.
I want to start by asking about the title, because the title of your book has this connection to Roland Barthes, who wrote this theoretical essay of the same name, Death of the Author. Why did you want to engage with Barthes in this way, and why did you want to title your novel after this essay?
Yeah, there are many layers to my choice of title with this. I have a master's in journalism, a master's in literature, and then a PhD in literature. So that's a lot of schooling, and that's a lot of having that essay shoved in my face. So that's always going to be there. And also as a creative writer, this idea of the author must die for the reader to live. That's at the center of that essay. As a creative writer, that's always rubbed me the wrong way, and it's always been something I've thought about. So when I was writing this, that definitely came forth. The title is deeply related, deeply rooted in the novel.
Why for you does that kernel, that idea of the author must die so that the reader can live, what rubs you the wrong way about that?
As a creative writer, I can only speak for myself in this regard, when I'm writing something, that whole metaphor of when you create something, it's like giving birth. Your DNA is all over that thing that you've written. It's inevitable. It is not something that can be changed or altered. It is what it is. It may be in different ways, in ways that the writer can't control, but it's always there. So this idea of separating the two, I just don't think it's possible, and I don't think it's necessary. I think that it flows both ways.
Well, I think that sort of perspective on the concept of Death of the Author felt really apparent to me in this novel. This is a very personal novel. I think it's not autofiction, but there's a lot of connections and parallels between your main character, Zelu, in this novel and your own life. Mm-hmm. She, like you, is Nigerian American. She's living in Chicago. She has her MFA and is a writer and an adjunct professor. Zelu has also been in a wheelchair since she had this accident that left her paraplegic at the age of 12. And she's kind of in this position where her family maybe doesn't expect much of her, but she has big dreams. She wants to do a lot and has a lot of thoughts about wanting to take agency over her own life. What are Zelu's thoughts about agency at the beginning of this book?
Zelu she's from this big Nigerian American family, and part of the culture is the community over the individual, and she's part of that. And so being Nigerian American, this push and pull between the individual, Americans are very individualistic, and the community coming above the individual, that's the Nigerian side. That push and pull has always been in conflict and kind of molded and merged with her. And so this idea of who am I, who are we, that's a question she's always kind of navigating. And then her being paraplegic, and then her being from this family that wants to protect her, but that becomes a very tight hold after a while. She's constantly navigating this idea of what is mine and what is What is the communities?
Zelu comes from a big family. She has 5 siblings who are all very successful. Family is important to her. Food, culture, being together is important to this family. And that Nigerian Americanness is really very present in the book. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering, can you talk a bit about what that means, I guess, for you in your own life? Because it seems like this is definitely something that's really draws from the importance of all these things for you.
Yes. I mean, this was what I wanted to write about from the beginning. From the first novel that I wrote, I wanted to write about the Nigerian American experience because, one, I don't feel like it's discussed enough. My own Nigerian American experience has been I've been in conversation with it from even before I was a writer. My siblings and I, we would always kind of turn and deal with it. It wasn't something where we decided on one thing and went with that. Like, oh, I want to be an American. Oh, I want to be Nigerian. We were both and neither. And I wanted to write about that. It's very important for me to write about that because the confusion, the clarity, like all the contradictions, it's just so much. In this novel, I just went in. I went in and put it directly on the page.
You mentioned earlier in that response, like this is something that you'd wanted to write about kind of from the very beginning of your career as a writer. But you've also said that you felt like you couldn't write this story until now. And I'm wondering what made you, I guess, realize now was the right time or now felt like, I'm able to get into some of these themes and tell some of these stories?
I had been thinking about it for a while. And in this case, I have 2 sisters. There are 3 of us, and then 1 younger brother, 7 years younger. My sisters were all 1 year apart, and I'm the youngest. And my middle sister passed. We're very close. We were the Trinity. And when this happened, that was when I knew. I started writing Death of the Author literally 2 days after her passing. It was as a way to deal with it. That gave me the courage, because I needed courage to write this one. There's so much of my actual family and me and all of my life in this book, and it was scary. And to do that, grief pulled me through it. The power that grief has and that feeling of it is time to put this down was what allowed me to write this thing.
Nnedi, I want to pivot a little bit back to something we were talking about earlier. Basically, the way that disability is talked about in this book, and you have your own connection with that yourself, where at 19 you had this spinal fusion surgery, which led to a complication where you became paralyzed yourself from the waist down. And I understand that was the time where you really turned to writing stories, and you were writing these little stories in the margins of a science fiction book that you had. And that was where you got into creative writing. It sounds like this has continued to inform your career to the point that you're, grappling with some similar types of experiences in Death of the Author. And I'm wondering, did you have a connection to storytelling before that surgery? And if not, what was it about that situation that made you want to turn to writing?
I was a big reader before. I was an athlete. And then when I wasn't on the tennis court or the track, I was in the library. And that was the only hint that I would be doing what I am doing today. Other than that, I didn't write anything creatively. I didn't make anything up. I just wasn't open to that idea of writing, actually being the person to write. I mean, both of my parents were doctors. Being Nigerians, there are, 4 careers: doctor, engineer, lawyer, and failure. You don't go into the arts. So it just didn't cross my mind. It was not in my orbit. I was interested in the sciences. I was good in math. And I did love reading, though. So that was the only hint. The moment when I was in that hospital, I was a paralyzed athlete, and they didn't know if I would ever walk again. That combination put me in a really dark state of mind. I started writing this story to myself on that book. It was I, Robot, and there was something about that moment. There was something when I put the pen to the page and my eyes started following the pen and I'm writing these words and then this story is coming out of my head. That moment was magical. That moment was cathartic. And it was a discovery. It was like an incredible, amazing discovery because I literally discovered storytelling in that hospital bed. It was intoxicating. It was sweet and it was delicious and it was energizing and invigorating. And it was like light that came into that dark room lit everything up, and all the darkness, those shadows that were descending on me went away. So it was powerful, and it was, I haven't stopped writing since, literally.
I mentioned earlier that there's a metafictional element to Death of the Author, which is that Zelu is a writer, and we actually get to see a lot of her own writing. There's a book within a book called Rusted Robots within Death of the Author. That's Zelu's book. She gets in this groove where she drafts this sci-fi novel. She's never written sci-fi before. What was she drawing on to conceive this book within the book? And I guess separately from that, what were you drawing on that made you want to put a book within the book?
I'm always thinking about the fact that the majority of people think that science fiction has one bloodline. It doesn't. It has multiple bloodlines. It's not everything comes from the science fiction classics. I didn't start writing science fiction because of what I'd read before. It wasn't a response to what I'd read, like things that I'd read before. I started writing science fiction from trips to Nigeria and seeing cell phones pop up in rural places and seeing very traditional practices, and then in cell phones included with those traditional practices, and being fascinated by that and thinking, what is the future going to be like here? You know, you don't have this infrastructure here, but then you have this supercomputer that's portable and chargeable that's invaded the area. What is the future going to be like here? That's what led me to writing science fiction. So with Zelu, when Zelu writes Rusted Robots, she's never written science fiction before. She's never even considered it. She doesn't particularly even like it. She writes this book about robots, about post-human robots. Where does that come from? Her experiences. She's thinking about the future through her personal experiences. I think in a lot of ways I was trying to explain, and this is in hindsight, not when I'm writing something, I don't outline and, I just write. But I think I was trying to explain the process of how one writes science fiction when they are not drawing off of what came before. I think that's what that is. It was a very interesting experience, but it happened organically. It wasn't a structure where I'm like, I'm going to write a book within a book. I did not think that. It just happened.
Mm. The book within a book, Rusted Robots, does become something that's very transformative for your character, Zelu. She gets this major, and sorry if this is kind of too spoilery, but it feels important to talk about. She ends up getting a major book deal. The book becomes adapted into a film. She becomes kind of almost cartoonishly famous off of this book. It's all very extreme. Mm-hmm. But that comes with a price for her. What did you want to explore here with this kind of meteoric rise and this person who was previously, an adjunct professor, a struggling writer, becoming suddenly very successful and very visible?
I was exploring a lot of things. One, I know, there are my own experiences as a writer who's had her work go through adaptation for film and TV. And I have lots of experiences with that, some positive, some not so positive, lots of it. And it's always at the forefront of my mind. So there's that. And I also have writer friends who have gone through all of that. And I've seen how odd it is and how in some ways damaging and complicated. It was great watching Zelu have to go through those things and deal with those things. It's more complicated than many think. And I wanted to show this with real honesty. As a writer who has gone through a lot of that, when I talk to people, they don't get it. They don't get it. They only see the result. They don't get the pain and the difficulty and the confusion and just the complication in all of it. They don't get that part of it. That's often not shown. So, yeah.
And I mean, yeah, you're right. It did feel very honest to me, again, as somebody who interviews authors, and I've talked to authors who have had their work adapted, and some of them have enjoyed the adaptations and some of them not so much. And it goes back again to that concept of death of the author, of you've written a thing, it gets adapted, other people touch it. Is it still really yours? The specific dynamic that's being talked about here is that Zelu writes this book that is set in Nigeria. It's very rooted in her culture. And the characters have Nigerian names that have significance within the context of the story and significance to her. the Hollywood movie adaptation whitewashes it. One of the characters literally becomes named Yankee. It gets set in the US. Again, it's a very extreme version of this process that can sometimes happen. But what did you want to say here by having this be the way that Zelu's work gets adapted?
I'll be honest, I've been through that. And I needed to write it out. You deal with these things and when they're over, you're just left with it. And my way of dealing with it was literally to write about it. I took Zelu through it just to see what that looked like. It was almost for my own good. Like I needed to see it and see that she survived it.
Yeah, almost a processing and showing that it can end up being okay in the end. You, I think, share with your character, Zelu, this real desire for your work to be interpreted in a way that is shaped by how you see your own work, right? You are a very decorated writer of science fiction. You've coined terms yourself to describe your writing, African futurism, African Jujuism, really wanting to highlight the fact that you being Nigerian American is so present in your work.
Yeah.
And you're very specific about those terms as opposed to something like Afrofuturism, which is like the term that a lot of people apply to your work that they might know, it's used more commonly. What does African futurism or African Jujuism mean to you, and why does it feel important to have that kind of language to describe your work?
So my first novel was published in 2005, so that's 20 years. One thing that's always frustrated me was I just felt like there was always a lens put in front of me to view me through, and that lens would filter out parts of what I was doing. And those parts that were filtered out were the parts that people weren't familiar with or didn't understand. And a lot of it was the Nigerian part. And I've always felt frustrated with that. I felt like the term Afrofuturism, it's a reductive term for me, and it doesn't properly describe what I'm doing at all. My work and it comes back to this term, death of the author. It comes back to Roland Barthes' essay, separating the author from their work, and why I get frustrated with that idea, because my work is very connected to me. It's very inspired by me, and not just inspired, it is me. And so when it's separated and then read as this other thing, certain aspects, important aspects, pivotal central aspects of what I'm doing are just erased. I'm not trying to make readers read things I'm not trying to be controlling in that regard. I'm trying to have my work understood as what it is. So I came up with the term African futurism and African Jujuism. Please look those up. Those are all, just Google them. There's an essay, my essay, not someone else's interpretation of my essay, but my essay that you can read where I define these terms and why I'm defining them. There is a reason, and it is beyond just the idea of genre. In a lot of ways, it's cultural. Death of the Author is probably the first book that I've written that I feel is finally being read for all of what it is. And that's deeply important to me.
There's so much in that answer that feels, again, so personal. And your identity is really manifest in this book. Your identity as a writer, your identity as Nigerian American, being both and neither, as you said before. This is a book that's really hitting, I think, at the heart of a creative crossroads we're finding ourselves at, about what it means to be a writer and what it means to be a writer in an age where artificial intelligence is allegedly able to write. What does it mean to you to be a writer?
It means to experience and process and throw out into the world and speak to the world. That's what it means. The experience is the magic. And then the processing of that experience. To me, there's a mystical aspect to it that can't be described or programmed. In terms of truly creative, innovative stuff, no, AI aren't going to be able to do that. You're not going to get truly innovative stuff because they're taking what's already been done and that's what they're pulling together from. Mm-hmm. So I think that it's just a money-making tool. And I think it's sad that we're using such a powerful technology for something so petty and unnecessary. There are things that AI are useful for. It is not in the creative space.
Mm-hmm. I think that was what was unexpected to me about your kind of take on it, was the fact that you're not completely against the concept of developing AI, but just that there's things that right now it can do and things that it's less successful at. I think that the blur between what it means to be a human and what it means to be a robot, to be kind of a computer, to have technology integrated into your life, and this sort of perhaps situation we're going to run into at some point where those lines become blurry is definitely at the heart of Death of the Author. There's a lot in there that I don't want to totally spoil, but there is at one point a character, Dr. Hugo Wagner, who's an engineer at MIT, who reaches out to Zelu and says to her, "I can make you a robot." And there's some tech that interacts with Zelu's disability. I'm wondering why this was a dynamic that you wanted to explore, the relationship between ability, disability, and technology.
Yeah, it's because, that's like a fantasy of mine. There's an engineer at MIT, Hugh Hare, and he's created these prosthetic limbs. He was a mountain climber, and he had an accident that made him unable to walk. Now he can climb farther and higher than he ever could. I'm obsessed with that guy. Looking at what he did, I started thinking about my own disability, and I think about the merging of technology and humanity. I'm not viewing it as the apocalypse. I don't see it as the end. I'm not looking at the machines taking over. I'm a very optimistic thinker, and as somebody with a disability, I look at technology in a way that where it can help with disabilities. It was wishful thinking. It was me just kind of fantasizing about what that would be like, and then taking it further and seeing, okay, if I had that happen, what are the repercussions as well? Like looking at it from the positive and the negatives.
The book ends with Zelu having a very major life decision to make, and we're left in a space that's a bit ambiguous about how that works out for her, but she is very defiant and focused on her own agency to the very end of the novel. She, says, for radio, I'll say screw patriarchy a lot.
Yes.
It's a bit of a stronger word that's in there. But she has this quest for freedom from patriarchy, from the judgments sometimes of her family, freedom from some of the limitations placed on her by her disability. How has that quest for freedom defined her life and her storytelling in this novel?
Yeah, it's a journey. It's a journey because she wants to be free and able to do all the things that she wants to do. But also, she loves her family. It's not about her running away from her family and never talking to them again because they're terror. It's not. She's linked. They're a part of her, like in ways that she could never undo. They're a part of her. How do you obtain that freedom that you seek when this is the body that you are? So how do you have all of that, but yet grab that freedom to do that thing that you want to do over there?
Staying on this theme of freedom, but going outside of the novel to you in your own life, I'm wondering, what does freedom mean for you, Nnedi, as somebody who's navigated some of this journey of balancing family with carving out a career that's counter to the expectations of family, perhaps, and dealing a bit with some of these same expectations and restraints that your character experiences in this novel?
Yeah, it's the same. That part is the same. I've had to navigate it. I know my parents did not approve of me being a writer. They don't make any money. It's not a career. So I had to navigate that. Part of the reason why I have 2 masters and a PhD and have been a professor and have been a journalist, that's my family. I couldn't just go and be a writer. I had to do all the other things as well. And I'm better for it. I understand that and I don't live in a vacuum. I'm connected to so many people and like family and obligations and all of that, but I still want what I want. You carry it all, and you have to be really honest and clear and work through so many things as you move. It's been difficult. It's definitely been difficult, but I've learned a lot along the way and just become a better person along the way.
I feel like that seems like a hopeful and I find somewhat inspirational note to end off on, just that it is possible to balance these things. It's hard, but it's possible. And it's, I think, worthwhile from the way that you talk about it. Definitely worthwhile. Nnedi, thank you again so much. It was such a pleasure talking with you today and diving into just all of the themes and all of the content. This is such a rich book that you've written with Death of the Author.
Thank you. Thank you. My pleasure.
That was my conversation with Nnedi Okorafor. She joined me from San Francisco. This episode was produced by Ryan B. Patrick with help from Ailey Yamamoto. Our senior producer is Jacqueline Kirk, and our executive producer is Aaron Balser. Shout out also to our audio tech, Marco Luciano, and to the entire CBC Books team. We could not make this show without them. Just a heads up for any writers listening, this is the last week you can enter the 2025 CBC Nonfiction Prize. The winner will receive $6,000 from the Canada Council for the Arts, a 2-week writing residency at the Banff Centre for Arts and Creativity, and have their work published on the CBC Books website. You can head to cbcbooks.ca for more information and to find out how to enter. The deadline is March 1st, and we can't wait to read your work. If you enjoyed today's show, you should check out the Bookends archive, which you can find on any podcast app. Here's a bit of my conversation with the Canadian sci-fi writer Nalo Hopkinson. From what I understand of your whole body of work, all of your fiction really pulls in one way or another from traditional folk stories to reflect and comment on real world history and events or real conditions that we see in our society currently. What inspires you to incorporate these folk stories in this way and to have them be such a part of the lives of the characters in your novels?
Well, there's a point as a reader when I realized how much fantasy was based in folklore and how much of it was based in British and European and sometimes Japanese folklore. And I thought, well, we have folklore too. I'm from the Caribbean. I can do this with our stuff as well. It also helps me. Plot does not come easily to me. And folktales are so... They've been told and retold for centuries. The plot is really it's succinct and it's, you can map it. So using the folktale as the spine of the story sometimes helps that way. But also, folktales are really the precursors to science fiction and fantasy. Mm-hmm. They are fantastical. They are political. They talk about how to live well with your neighbors. They talk about the abuses that people in power can do. And so there's very much a lineage from folklore to modern day science fiction and fantasy. It feels very natural to me to do it.
You can head to the link in the description to catch the rest of that conversation. And don't forget to hit the follow button so that you won't miss any of the fantastic guests we have coming up on the show. I'm Mattea Roach, and this is Bookends. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time. Because when the book ends, the conversation begins.